In the late 19th century, as Southern California shifted from dusty ranch land into a strategic frontier of American expansion, a small circle of old money families quietly positioned themselves to control its future. This was Southern California between the 1870s and the early 1900s, a place marketed to the public as sunshine and opportunity, but engineered behind closed doors by investors, railroad barons, land syndicates, and inherited wealth from the East Coast and Europe. What made these families unusual was not public fame or political office, but the way their money moved invisibly, shaping cities before cities officially existed. At this time, Southern California was not yet the economic powerhouse it would become. Los Angeles was still a modest town, San Diego was underdeveloped, and Orange County was mostly agricultural land. But to old money families with patient capital, this region represented something rare: scale. Land was cheap, regulations were minimal, and local governments were easily influenced. These families did not arrive as pioneers, they arrived as planners. The earliest fortunes came from outside the region: railroad profits from the Midwest, banking wealth from New York, and European investment capital flowed westward. Families like the Huntington, the Doheny, the Chandler, and allied syndicates did not simply buy property, they assembled land strategically. Entire neighborhoods, ports, and transportation corridors were purchased in advance, often through shell companies to avoid public scrutiny. Transportation was the first lever of control. Rail lines determined which towns survived and which failed. When rail access shifted, land values followed instantly. Old money families understood this, and many of them either owned railroads outright or financed the companies that did. Southern California's growth patterns were not organic, they were mapped years ahead by private interests who controlled steel, schedules, and stations. Water was the second and more powerful weapon. Southern California's climate made water the ultimate currency. Without it, land was worthless. With it, land multiplied in value overnight. Old money families funded aqueduct projects, secured water rights, and quietly influenced municipal decisions. The Los Angeles Aqueduct, completed in the early 20th century, was not just an engineering achievement, it was a financial turning point that rewarded those who had already acquired land in the San Fernando Valley. These families did not operate alone, but they did operate together. Informal alliances formed through marriages, shared investments, and board memberships. Newspapers owned by old money families shaped public opinion, framing massive infrastructure projects as civic progress while masking private profit. The Chandler family's control of media became a central tool in legitimizing expansion and silencing opposition. Unlike self-made industrialists, old money families played a longer game. They accepted slow returns in exchange for permanence. Their goal was not quick wealth, but generational control. Estates were placed in trusts, holdings were diversified across land, oil, agriculture, and utilities, and influence was preserved through legal structures rather than public authority. Oil discovery accelerated everything. When oil was struck in places like Signal Hill and Huntington Beach, families who already owned the surface rights gained immediate dominance. Royalties flowed without the need for labor or public exposure. Oil wealth merged with land wealth, reinforcing a closed economic loop that excluded newcomers. Publicly, Southern California was sold as a democratic paradise for migrants. Privately, zoning laws, restrictive covenants, and exclusive developments ensured that access to prime land remained limited. Old money families shaped who could live where, who could build, and who could profit. These decisions hardened class boundaries long before the region's population exploded. By the 1920s, the framework was complete. Cities expanded along predetermined lines, wealth concentrated upward, and institutions, from banks to universities, were tied to the same family networks. What looked like rapid growth was actually the final stage of a plan initiated decades earlier. These families rarely appeared in headlines as villains or heroes. Their power came from absence, not presence. They funded campaigns without running for office, influenced courts without arguing cases, and shaped cities without ever appearing at groundbreakings. Southern California did not rise by accident. It was assembled piece by old money that understood time as its greatest asset. By the end of this period, the foundations were irreversible. New wealth would arrive later through Hollywood, aerospace, and technology, but it would build on a system already owned. The old money families had written the rules, drawn the borders, and secured the future before most Americans ever set foot in Southern California. By the 1910s, old money families in Southern California had moved beyond speculation and into system building. This phase was not about acquiring land anymore. It was about locking control into institutions that could not easily be dismantled. Banks, utility companies, ports, and legal frameworks became the new instruments of dominance. Private banks played a critical role. These were not storefront banks catering to workers. They were financial hubs designed to move capital silently. Credit was extended selectively. Entire development projects lived or died based on whether old money-backed banks approved loans. This created a dependency loop. New entrepreneurs needed capital, but capital required alignment with established interests. Utilities followed the same pattern. Electricity, gas, and water services were consolidated under companies quietly financed or controlled by old money trusts. Public officials often lacked the technical knowledge or political leverage to challenge these monopolies. Rate structures favored industrial and elite residential areas, while working-class districts lagged behind. Infrastructure inequality was not accidental, it was engineered. Ports and shipping were another pillar. Control over Los Angeles and Long Beach ports allowed old money families to profit from global trade without manufacturing anything themselves. Warehouses, shipping contracts, and customs influence ensured that international commerce flowed through channels they controlled. Southern California's rise as a Pacific gateway directly enriched these families. Legal architecture sealed the system. Zoning laws restricted density in elite neighborhoods. Racially restrictive covenants, though later outlawed, were initially enforced through private contracts. These measures preserved property values and prevented demographic shifts that could weaken elite control. Courts routinely upheld these agreements, reflecting the same social class biases embedded in the system. What made this phase particularly effective was invisibility. There were no dramatic takeovers or public scandals. Everything appeared legal, bureaucratic, and orderly. Growth continued, jobs were created, and the public saw progress. Few recognized that opportunity itself had been filtered through a narrow set of family interests. By the end of this era, Southern California's economic skeleton was complete. Even when individuals failed, the system held. Old money families no longer needed to micromanage. The architecture of control now worked automatically. The Great Depression of the 1930s posed the first real test to old money dominance in Southern California. Land values collapsed, banks failed nationwide, and public trust in elites eroded. Yet while many fortunes disappeared elsewhere, Southern California's old money adapted rather than collapsed. Liquidity was their advantage. While smaller investors were over-leveraged, old money families had diversified holdings and cash reserves. They acquired distressed properties quietly, expanding their portfolios during the worst economic downturn in modern history. What looked like economic devastation to the public became an acquisition window behind closed doors. Federal intervention also reshaped the playing field. New Deal programs poured money into infrastructure, defense, and housing. Old money families positioned themselves as intermediaries, contractors, suppliers, landowners leasing property to the government. Public funds flowed into private hands through legally sanctioned channels. World War II accelerated this process. Aerospace factories, naval bases, and logistics hubs transformed Southern California into a military-industrial center. Old money families who already controlled land near ports and airfields benefited disproportionately. War production created new wealth, but it rested on foundations old money already owned. Social change did introduce friction. Labor unions gained strength, and public scrutiny increased.
Yet old money families adjusted by shifting visibility. Professional managers replaced family members. Trusts replaced personal ownership. Influence moved further into abstraction. By the 1950s, Southern California emerged from crisis wealthier and more centralized than before. Old money had not only survived disruption, it had absorbed it.
Post-war Southern California is often remembered as a land of fresh opportunity. Hollywood exploded, suburbs multiplied, a new middle class emerged. On the surface, it appeared that old money influence was fading, replaced by celebrity, technology, and mass consumption. In reality, old money simply changed camouflage. Film studios leased land from old estates. Suburban developers borrowed from banks tied to old trusts. Freeways increased land values for holdings acquired decades earlier. Even when new fortunes appeared, they paid rent, financially or structurally, to existing power. Old money families avoided cultural visibility. They did not chase fame. They funded institutions instead: universities, museums, foundations. Philanthropy served dual purposes: legacy preservation and influence laundering. Naming rights replaced ownership headlines. Political influence also shifted. Instead of overt pressure, old money relied on lobbying, campaign financing, and advisory boards. Decisions were shaped before votes occurred. This made resistance difficult, as there was no single villain to oppose. By the 1970s, Southern California looked dynamic and diverse, yet beneath the surface, land ownership patterns showed remarkable continuity. The names had changed, but the deeds had not. Today, Southern California appears disconnected from its old money origins. Tech startups, global investors, and international wealth dominate headlines. But the systems built by old money families still shape outcomes. Trusts remain intact. Land remains consolidated. Infrastructure decisions continue to favor established corridors. Even global capital must operate within frameworks designed over a century ago. What makes old money powerful is not visibility, but durability. It does not need recognition to function. It survives leadership changes, economic cycles, and cultural revolutions. Its greatest success is becoming unnoticeable. Southern California was not simply built, it was pre-owned. The families who assembled it rarely appear in popular history, yet their influence persists in zoning maps, water rights, and property lines. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame. It is about recognizing how power actually works, slowly, quietly, and across generations. Old money families did not dominate Southern California by force, but by patience. And in that patience, they built a region that still moves to rhythms they set long ago.